Systems engaged. Frequencies synchronized. Prepare for incoming transmission. Coming to you from somewhere in the multiverse, this is Robots from Tomorrow. This show is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and as always your podcatcher of choice. For the full archive featuring over 800 episodes of comics and comics-friendly content like interviews, book discussions, and freeform tomfoolery, please go to robotsfromtomorrow.net. Here is your host, Greg.
Hello everybody, welcome to the show. This is Robots from Tomorrow. My name is Greg, glad to have you with us. Today, as we gear up for the release of my talk with Aditya Bidikar about his new Image miniseries and mainstream comics writing debut, In Your Skin, we're re-releasing the two-part conversation I had with him and letterist, cartoonist, friend of the show, John Workman, back in 2022 in our Robots Remastered format. Robots Remastered. Better audio, shorter runtime with no real content loss, more bang for no bucks. What more can you ask for? We originally talked for about 3 hours, which is why I broke that conversation into 2 episodes originally. These remasters keep the same structure, even though we chopped out about 40 minutes all told. The whole thing is loaded with production stories, lettering insights, cross-generational bonding, and more than a little fanboying in all directions. Mutual admiration society all around. But hey, isn't that what podcasts are for sometimes? So sit back, relax, and enjoy the first part of this lettering and comics masterclass from Aditya Bidikar and John Workman. If you take the standard creative team of a mainstream comic book and sort of map their roles to those of a standard 4-piece rock band, you might come out with something that looks like this. The writer is the lead singer, the line artist is the guitarist, the colorist, the bassist, and the letterer, the drummer. And it's that last one and their role in comics that I wanted to talk about today, and I have 2 amazing guests with me to do that. It would take our entire time allotted to go over my first guest credits, but suffice it to say that the list of books this letterer has worked on are, in the words of Multiversity alumnus and sketch guru David Harper, quote, all bangers, unquote. When he's not working on series like The Department of Truth or the upcoming Batman Superman or the recently announced Aquaman Andromeda with writer Ram V, he is part of the ongoing collaboration with Ram and artist Anand K that has given us such OGNs as Graffiti's Wall and last year's Blue and Green. He's also the co-host of the Letters and Lines podcast with fellow letterer and editor of the Panel by Panel comics magazine, Haas. He was Multiversity Comics' favorite letterer of 2021, Mr. Aditya Bidikar. My second guest needs little introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He is one of the most respected creators in comics for his decades-long career, working as a letterer for the likes of Tommy Lee Edwards, the late John Paul Leon, and of course, Walt Simonson, among others. A cartoonist in his own right, he was also the art director for Heavy Metal from 1977 to 1983, in arguably the golden age of that prestige comics magazine. He continues to dazzle us with every project he works on, and it is my pleasure to have him back on the show after far too long to talk with us about his craft and profession, Mr. John Workman. John, Aditya, how's it going?
Pretty good.
Good.
It's a nice Friday evening. I've not had any work today, so I've just been relaxing.
I wanted to start off by talking about lettering as a craft. Lay folks, when they think about your position in making comics at all, they would think of you basically just the person that writes the words from the script onto the artwork. But in my experience, it's actually just as much drawing involved as the line artist. You're just drawing letter forms instead of other shapes and things. How much of your job is a matter of theory, knowing what to do, where to place things, versus actually having the ability/talent to draw? Could somebody without a cartoonist background be a decent letterer just having theory knowledge and illustrator, say?
Someone, yeah, probably. There's a technical aspect to it, of course. I learned early on, though, how important the lettering is. I would draw what I thought was a decent page of artwork, and then I would ruin it with my lousy lettering. It was terrible. I remember in 1967 sending off a 27-page story that I'd written and drawn and lettered to Carmine Infantino. He'd just become editorial director at DC. He was encouraging and all that, but it was pretty bad. But the worst part of it was probably the lettering. And I started taking classes in calligraphy and such, and they didn't help a bit. It didn't really pertain to comics. So I remember I started stealing from other people. I would do things that John Costanza or Ben Oda had done. And I took a 1946 issue of Comics Cavalcade. It had a Green Lantern story with some nice lettering in it. So I sat there and made a million A's and a million B's and such until I kind of got that down. But everybody has their own way of doing things. I remember when I first started working at DC, Jack Adler and Joe Orlando were kind of amazed by the way I made an S. And it was particular to me. I can't fully explain that. But the main thing that I've learned over the years is whether I'm doing the artwork or I'm lettering for somebody else, that you can make the lettering help the storytelling. The simplest part of that is just keeping them in order so people don't read the wrong balloon. You go from A to B to C to D and all that. But also, you can give a plus to the artwork by placing lettering behind a figure or something that's in the art, or equal with it, or in front of it, or even coming out of the balloon. And I love doing that sort of thing. And one thing that I did, and that Walt Simonson has always done, is break the border. Because if you have a rectangle, the artwork might be interesting, but it's more interesting if the shape of the overall thing is affected by the balloons that break the border. You no longer have a rectangle so much, you have a much more interesting visual there.
I saw those for the first time in your work. I remember recently I read a review where somebody said, broke the first balloon onto the border, but not the second one. And I was like, immediately it made sense to me because that would have left this weird triangular shape by itself. The fact that you didn't break the second balloon, but only broke the first balloon, actually created a much more interesting shape for the panel. Like, that's something that I've basically been stealing from you for years.
Well, I kind of stole that from Al Williamson and Carmine and various other people because they would give a plus to their artwork by breaking the balloon border, or the panel border, I mean. And it does. I read a book recently, a graphic novel, which I really liked. I won't go into the details about it. It was a historical thing. The artwork was all right. And I remember thinking, gosh, I would have loved to have lettered that because I would have gone in and made those panel borders more interesting by breaking them. And it's just amazing what that does. And Walt is a master of it. Here. Here's a Walt Simonson. Let's see if I can figure out how to.
Okay, that is so cool.
Walt's layouts from an upcoming Thor-related book. And of course, there's Walt back doing Beta Ray Bill. But
she's still my heart.
We'll go through and tweak it a little bit and do some whiteouts on where I made mistakes and such. But you can see the things here where they infect the borders, that earth sound. How am I doing this?
That looks fantastic.
Yeah.
I actually had questions about the way you work with Mr. Simonson. So the way he put it in an interview, essentially he just sends the page to you and you do the paneling first. And his figures are only incredibly rough at that point. And then he actually decides how to draw based on your lettering. Is that true?
I think it's more the other way. I decide what I'm going to do based on what he's done or what Tommy Lee or anyone that I've lettered. There have been a few cases where there's not a lot that I could do. That the artwork was maybe not up to par or something. I could maybe add to it a little bit, but I depend on the artwork to make decisions and do things. And if it's kind of mediocre, my lettering comes out as mediocre plus a little bit. But it's if it's great art, and that's what I get from.
I know what you mean.
Oh, well, I think in something that I read of yours, you were talking about the same sort of thing. So you do see this the way that I do.
I hope so. I mean, I've been working on this for 11 years. And at this point, what I do is, like, for a year or so, I study a particular letterer, try to see what their particular tics are. And I try to integrate the things out of that I like. So right now, for example, I'm obsessed with Tom Orz's lettering. I love the way his letter forms are all incredibly precise. But then he'll do these massive flourishes once in a while. So it's this immaculate thing with this absolutely organic thing, plunked in the middle of that. So I love integrating that into my lettering, or like those broken borders that you do, or Recently I noticed something where your caption borders tend to be thicker than your balloon borders. And that's something that I started doing recently, where I make the caption borders a little bit thicker. I think it gives them a little solidity, kind of make them sink into the artwork a little bit more. I just like trying all these things that other people have and trying to see what can, because the way Greg was saying, I actually don't come from a design background at all. I came into comics as a writer and I started lettering because I had no other option because I couldn't pay somebody to letter my work. So I started learning how to letter, and the letter forms came much later for me. I started hand lettering around 5 or 6 years ago, and that's when I really got into letter forms. But before that, for me, it was the compositional aspect of the lettering that was interesting, because that's the first thing I tried to learn, that you start in one place and then the lettering takes you through the characters and kind of lands you in a particular place. So as a writer, that was always something that I was kind of aware of. So when I started lettering, I used fonts by other people like typesetting, and like what I was trying to do was use it as a tool of storytelling. And it was only when I started working on lettering full time that I realized that, you know what, there's a design aspect to this, there's a drawing aspect to this that I need to be better at. So that's been a subject of study for me more than anything else over time. Even right now, I'm learning how to draw, and I'm hoping that that lets me just get more control over my lettering work, because digital lettering makes it easy for you to get started because you can use typesetting and fonts. But as you go further and further, you tend to find that limiting, and you want to integrate more organic aspects, more like hand-drawn aspects. You don't want the font to control the design. You want to be the one controlling the design. So that's when I kind of really started going into hand-drawn sound effects and, even at this point, hand lettering, because I realized it's so much more of the control is with you when you can actually just go in and change stuff, like draw stuff. So what do you feel about the whole digital lettering over the last 20, 25 years? Do you think it's added to lettering, or do you think it's taken away?
I remember when computers were first being used by more than artists, secretaries and such were putting together advertising brochures, and some of them were so horrible. They had no feeling of design about them or how to really grab the eye and all. There were aspects of that with the comic book lettering of the time when it first started coming in. I still am kind of bothered by it, but I use commercial typefaces to simulate comic lettering. But even there, it takes more time, but I go in and play with some of the stuff just to give it a little more humanity, a little difference. And I hope that I'm always learning. Sometimes I'm amazed. You must be aware of this too. You go back and look at something you did years ago, and maybe you think, oh, I can do better now, but there's sometimes something that you lost that has sort of disappeared. So I try to bring it back if I find something that I was doing that was interesting years ago. But I also depend on studying people's lettering. I read through the entirety of the Kniv-Terry and the Pirates. And as it progressed, I couldn't believe how good it was. It started out as a boys' adventure thing with stereotypical characters, and it wound up with human beings in it and incredible writing and storytelling. But the lettering, I think Frank Ingley was the name of the letterer. I learned from him, and he did things with bold letters that I hadn't really thought of doing. And so on a recent Jupiter's Legacy, Mark Millar's book that Tommy Lee has been drawing, I thought, well, I'm going to try that out. And I thought it really worked well, going for the Frank Ingley look on the bold stuff. And it involved a movement of the lines, really, and having more space sometimes between one line of lettering and others. I thought it really worked well, and it drove home those bold words. There was something I tried a few years ago that the editors didn't like, sort of a teenage girl book from Archie of Jinx. It was Little Jinx back in the 1960s, and they had aged her a little bit. Yeah. And I did the lettering on it, a lot of fun. But I thought the balloon style in probably what was month to month or bi-weekly to bi-weekly, the best-selling American comic book ever was Captain Marvel. And the balloon style on that was almost like thought balloons. but it was for all the balloons. I did it that way. And I thought, I'll try that with little Jinx, and I'll hedge my bets, because if they don't like it, I'll tell them just send me the scan and I'll replace those with regular balloons. And they didn't like it. Now, here was Captain Marvel selling upwards of 2 million with those balloons. And I thought that, I think this would help the sales, actually. But I wound up going back to just the regular sort of balloon forms. That's something else, too. And I wanted to ask you about this. My balloon forms were terrible when I started up at DC. And I was unhappy with what they were doing. Someone told me it was Carmine, which I don't believe, because he was really good at design. But someone had decided that no balloons should touch the top border. There should always be some little area of artwork there, and then the balloon and the tape, all that. And I thought, that's crazy. They're encroaching on the artwork if they could put it up there. And of course, my thing of breaking the border.
Yeah.
Which I ignored what they were doing. And I went and for that, I didn't get any good with the balloon shapes and all until I started working on the Batman stories and Detective for Marshall Rogers. And Marshall and I talked it over. He wanted certain things harking back to the Batman of 1940. And I thought, well, that sounds good. But for the regular balloons, Marshall had a background in, what's the term here? I'm
surveying?
Buildings, architecture. There we go. And that word flew out of my head. Interesting stories about Marshall. We should talk sometime. But anyhow, I used a French curve to create these balloons that really went with his artwork. But that didn't mean that they worked with everybody else. Yes. But when Walt and I started working on Thor, it was Walt's suggestion that we just do ovals. Just regular old ovals for most of the stuff. And I thought, well, I don't know. And it worked beautifully. And since then, most of the stuff with most people has been ovals for me. I've also done things that are complete circles. John Paul and I, when we did Winter Men, we talked about it first and came up with circles. So sometimes I think the simplest answer is the best one. And Walt really hit it on those oval balloons.
I definitely agree. I think people do I have a tendency to kind of get into the weeds about a lot of this stuff, but you need to be able to step back and essentially be able to simplify, because, there's this weird thing that people keep saying that comic book lettering should be invisible. And I usually use you as exhibit A for the fact that's a load of crap. But the thing is, if you actually look at your lettering, it is, as you say, it's simple. Like, it's all circles, it's big shapes. And what you're essentially doing is not being afraid to be a presence on the page, right? You're not trying to hide. That's all that's sort of happening. So I don't think complexity is always the way to do that. Essentially, I think Simonson's artwork, for example, is quite busy. Like, it's got a lot of lines. And then to have those big white shapes is actually really helpful. So suddenly you can orient yourself around the page. I know artists who used to use white in their colors quite a bit, who kind of stopped doing that after a conversation about, you can do that using the lettering. Like, the lettering is a big blob of white. So you don't necessarily need to do that in the coloring itself, because you're then fighting against those two things. So even in coloring, for example, people are afraid to use white because white is simple. Like, they always want to be seen doing something on the page. But sometimes white is the right solution. You don't always need to be doing big stuff. Also, I think your letter forms, they are quite intricate. Like, your G's and your S's are very distinctive, like your R's. So I think with those simple big balloons really go well. You can't do ornate stuff on ornate stuff and not have the reader be a little confused, right? So I think, that kind of simplicity is a big tool in somebody's toolbox. Yeah. Even your sound effects, like, they're kind of, I used to think that you would get them typed out and then paste them on the page. But I think Todd Klein told me that you actually drew all of them while you were doing those. But it's immaculate type. Like, I love how you did those.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I worried about sound effects. And one thing about Marshall, and actually a lot of other artists of that time period, they would rough in the sound effects. And so a lot of the stuff I did on Marshall's, it was just inking, maybe playing with it a little bit, but mostly inking what he had already done. Walt would rough them in, and it was a real challenge to do. And sometimes I didn't meet the challenge. He would say, do this one a little different. So I'd redo the thing. But it was a challenge to make it work with what was happening in that panel. And I have to admit, my stuff at that time, my sound effects were very mechanical. And I would measure everything out. And I remember Saul Harrison, who was the vice president up at DC, we were talking one time and he said, do me a favor and just do a quick version of the name of the high school I went to. And it was Franklin K. Lane High School, if I remember correctly. So I got up my ruler and measured and all that. And when I came to the space between the L and the A, he said, look, mechanically that doesn't work. You got to move them closer, make it better. And the lane, the L, the A, N, E, they have to be a little tighter than the E, at the end. And he said, if it looks right, it is right. Truer words were never spoken.
Nice.
But I got kind of away from that. And part of it was Walt. He called me up one time and he said, have you ever looked at the sound effects in BC, the comic strip? And BC is a humor strip and all that. And I said, well, I hadn't really looked at it. And he said, well, take a look and maybe do something like that in some of the Thor stuff. And I thought, well, that's not going to work, bringing humor into Thor. But I started kind of playing around with that, and it was great fun. It was very organic. And also around the same time, somebody asked me to letter a book. It was an independent book, and I can't even remember the title now. But he took pains. He said, letter it as close to what Karl Barks would have done as you can. And Karl Barks, of course, he lettered his own stuff, but his wife, I guess, wound up the principal letterer on the stuff, and she did a beautiful job. But his sound effects were very tall and very thin. And it kind of threw me, but I adapted that to some of the Thor stuff and to other things that I've done. So you never know what will work when you give it a try.
No, I think some of my favorite sound effects that you did were sound effects that would look like almost as if you put a brush effect down and then created a border around it. And I always wondered how you did those. Did you actually use like a brush to kind of rough it out? Or
a lot
were
of
those actually just created by drawing the border?
Well, a lot of them, and I try to do this now on the computer when I'm doing sound effects of that type, I used a really big, thick magic marker at that time. And I would do it up. And then I didn't have a computer, but I had a copy machine. So I would reduce it or enlarge it to whatever size I wanted. And then I'd trace it off. I have a light table right here, and I would put the artwork down over the lettering that I'd done, get in a position and trace it off there. And sometimes I wanted a big, thick border, and other times a thinner border. I do that now, creating sound effects on the computer. And I love the fact that I can instantly get a thicker or thinner border. And I really like titles, logos and sound effects on the computer. It's a lot of fun.
I love, so my process is that I draw a lot of sound effects in Photoshop, and then I kind of copy paste them into Illustrator, and then I kind of give them borders and shadows and things like that. So essentially the same process, but kind of like a digital version of that process. That's actually, I remember I saw one of your sound effects from Thor, and I wanted to kind of see if I could recreate that on the computer. And a lot of my study has been actually like, you kind of keep going backwards through letterers and, read stuff from the 40s or 50s. And then sometimes you hit upon something that's completely been forgotten. Like you were talking about your own work earlier. And then I can see I can steal that, and that looks really innovative if I do it now. So
like it comes back around.
Exactly. And then obviously other people notice that, and then they start doing that. Yeah, because I remember one of the really popular things right now is to do like one black line and then like a white shadow under it. And I did that on a book called Coffin Bound, and I was stealing from you because you had done that on, I think, some of your lettering over John Paul Leon. And I was like, okay, well, why hasn't anybody done that? We could just do that digitally. So I started doing that, and now I see it everywhere. So, but yeah, it's like we're all stealing from you, basically.
I had a thought going from the quote unquote debate, visible versus invisible. And like Aditya said, John could not be more visible. He was the first letterer that I noticed even before I knew your name. I was just like, that stuff looks different, whether it's the particularness of the letters or almost like a italic slant to some of his text look different. And then, of course, you're talking about some of those sound effects, like the thundering sounds of scragadoom is right across the page. You're like, that burned into my brain decades later. Connecting that to what John said, I think visible versus invisible. I think invisible is when it looks right. Visible means almost setting itself apart from the page and sort of calling attention to itself in a way that may not be the best. So if letterers say they want to be invisible, they're not saying they don't want to be noticed. They want to be, it's like unobtrusive, maybe.
I actually compare this to 4/4 drumming versus somebody like Keith Moon. Like they both have their place. Like so one person does 4/4 and the other guy kind of goes all over the place. So he's kind of doing like a solo as well. But depending on the team, depending on the song, it works, right? I think that if you as a letterer are distracting from the artwork, that's a problem. But if you're adding to the artwork, you're adding things. For example, like Simonson's Thor, the first issue starts with those doom going on like in like over pages. Now, those need to be big and bold because there's no other information coming at the moment, right? Like it's only at the end that you find out that guy who's kind of with the hammer and all of that. So for that moment, those dooms need to kind of really stand out. So, okay, remember this, there's something happening there, right? So it's just a tool. Like there's no way one can say that one is good and one is bad, right?
Yeah. So you can be loud and flashy and expressive in the lettering and still be invisible if you've picked a project that allows for that, say a Kirby designed mythological god title. Yeah, you can be invisible and be like, scragadoom, literally across the entire page. Totally fits. Nobody questions it. So we've been talking about digital lettering and hand lettering, and reading into both your processes, I wanted to get you to talk about them a little bit. And it seems that there's almost three aspects of this. There's completely analog lettering as you're drawing it on the board. You're completely digitally lettering. You're using a tablet or something. Or you are doing some sort of hybrid, in which case you are drawing analog and then composing digitally or doing that. So I don't know which one of you wants to start, but I feel like you've both done each of those three. And so if you could talk a little bit about your process.
Should I go first?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Go alphabetically.
Yeah. So the thing is, at this point, it's very difficult to do work on the boards if you're doing big two work or, corporate work, because
you don't get boards.
For them, the delivery timing is like a big thing. Secondly, I think a lot of writers have forgotten how to get things right in drafts before the lettering. So everybody wants to make revisions after the lettering is in. And so I've done hand lettering for 3 books at this point. And with all of them, I had to really tell them that, listen, very limited edits. Okay, you're not going to get to edit this properly. You're not going to be able to rewrite this afterwards. And one of them actually changed their mind and decided to go back to digital because they were like, you know what, we did 3 pages. And then they realized, wait, I can't actually edit this anymore. And they were like, no, I can't do that. I have to go back to digital. Right. The other thing is, for me, it's also physical distance. I live in India. Most of my artists are in the US or UK. So we can't really do that complete boards thing as well. Plus, I don't think I'd be confident enough. I don't think I am a confident enough hand letterer to do that just yet. On the other hand, what I have done quite a bit is I print blue lines and then letter over those. And then I kind of paste it up digitally. The problem I had with that is that essentially 70% of the work is production work at that point. 30% of the work is lettering. The lettering takes maybe 20 minutes. And then I'm sitting there for an hour and a half, scanning the page and then putting it up and then, removing the blue line and making sure it's lined up correctly, all of those things. Right. And I wish if I had an assistant to do those, I think I'd be doing a lot more hand lettering. And the final thing that I've actually found myself really comfortable with is that I actually digitally hand letter. So I have an iPad here and I also have an Apple Pencil. So I can actually show you guys this. Hold on. Adobe Sketch apparently is no longer available, something that I was very afraid of happening while I was lettering blue and green. But yeah, so essentially I would letter, I had a blue line kind of lines and I would letter it and then I would kind of paste it up in Photoshop and then draw the balloons in Photoshop. So that is a process that I found pretty easy to do. It's actually very comfortable. But I do feel like there is something to lettering on paper that is still lost in that. So I don't know like how, like you, I think letter in Photoshop, right? How do you feel that stacks up to your older hand lettering? Do you feel there's a comfort in being able to correct things, or like, what do you feel about that?
Oh, yes. Before I started doing the type of lettering I do now, where it's on a Wacom tablet, I would letter things as overlays based on Xeroxes. And then they would send me 600 DPI scans of the final inked art, and I would place them. But I would look at these sometimes enormous letters and figure, oh, gee, that one's leaning a little bit. And so I'd go in and fix them. And I was really doing damage to them in some cases, not always, but it was taking away the humanity. And Cliff Chang, he and I were talking one time, and he suggested that I cut out the middleman and start lettering directly on the tablet rather than doing it on a piece of vellum and then scanning it in and all. And I tried that with a couple of corrections, and it seemed to work. And then I was doing some stuff for Titan, and Martin Eden was the editor there, and he allowed me to do a sort of a sample story on the Wacom, and it worked out well. I enjoyed it. It had the feeling of hand lettering, although I had to admit that I had to be deliberately messy in order to make it look a little more human. And that was kind of fun. And I started drawing around the same time, the Wacom tablet, and I really enjoyed that. Again, I had to be deliberately messy in order to give it more of a human feeling, but it was fun. The thing that I hated was that there was no original art. I could print out 1 million copies of something, but there was nothing, the pencils showing through and all that stuff. It wasn't the same, but I really enjoy it. And I'm very happy with computer. It's, as you said, it's hard now for me to hand letter.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, that's some of my hand lettering. So as you can see, it's like very really pale blue artwork, and then I hand letter on top of that.
Yeah,
this is like 5 years old. I think I would be much better now.
Oh, that's how I used to do this stuff. There was an artist in the UK who was doing Batman and Detective, wonderful stuff. And they would give it to me after the inks were done. So I had to do these paste ups, or in some cases, letter right on it if there was an open area there. And I used blue lines. And I thought, I wonder if he's going to be bothered by this because his artwork is suddenly going to have blue lines on it. He didn't complain, but I still worry about that I did some damage to his originals. I think it
improves them, honestly.
Yeah.
Well, the very first story I ever hand lettered for anyone other than myself or Bob Smith, there were a few other people, was a Mike Grell Batman story. And all the time I thought, I'm ruining Grell's originals here. I'm doing a terrible job. And it is awful. I look back at it recently, and big, thick balloon tails. They should have been much thinner. And I still hadn't caught on, as I said, to how to effectively do the balloon borders. Julie Schwartz immediately gave me something else to letter. So I thought, well, either Julie's hasn't really looked at what I did, or he actually likes it or sees some potential there. But I did learn as I went along. I really owe a lot to Marshall Rogers. The talks we had prior to working on the Batman stuff really showed me the right direction to go. And then Walt, boom, there I kind of understood a lot of things I didn't understand. And Walt is a great letterer. I don't know if you've seen any of his stuff, but
did the Manhunter stuff, right? Like Manhunter was all him.
I think that was mostly Ben, but he lettered, I'm sure that the sound effects and the titles were Walt's. But I think the regular balloons were Ben's, or Ben Otis, or someone else, Gaspar, Saladino maybe. But there are some things that Howie Chaykin did early on for DC. The Gray, what was it, Fafford and the Gray Mouser? I think.
Yes, Swords and...
I thought that was Mignola.
That was the epic mini from like the early 90s.
Oh,
in the late 70s, there was a sword and something. I can't remember the name of the title, but yeah.
This was like 1973 or 74, and Walt lettered those for Howie.
I need to hunt that down.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Well, but you mentioning Gaspar actually reminds me. I think a newer letterer was talking to Gaspar, and they asked him, like, how do your sound effects look like they match the artist's art all the time? Like, how do you kind of switch them up? I switch up styles so easily. And Gaspar said, like, you know what? They actually draw the sound effects. I'm just following their lead. So, that like kind of thing of marrying the sound to the artwork, because like you need to follow the artist's lead to get the same vibe. then obviously Gaspar said like, that makes me look versatile. So
There's a Gaspar story that's great if you want to hear it for a second
Yes.
here.
Cool.
I think one of the all-time great logos, which was done by Gaspar, is Swamp Thing. It tells you the story of the character just looking at that logo. Swamp on the top, thing on the bottom. It was wonderful. And when I joined up at DC, or shortly after, initially they had me doing logos and cover lettering, not interior stuff. And Joe Orlando came in one time. Swamp Thing's sales had gone down after Bernie and Lynn were gone. And he figured he would jazz up the book with a new logo. And he gave me a rough that he had worked out. And it looked like a 1950s flying saucer comic or something. It was totally inappropriate for Swamp Thing. And I did it, hoping all the time that Joe would look at it and throw it in the garbage. And instead, it was used for several issues. And I felt so bad because here was this beautiful thing. As I said, one of the great logos.
It's a perfect logo. Yeah.
I made up for it a couple of years later. They were doing reprints of the initial few issues, the 10 or 12 issues, whatever, that Lynn and Bernie had done. And they wanted a logo of the Swamp Thing in one line. And I stole completely from Gaspar in doing that newer version of the logo. It was really as close to his as I could get. So I made up for my horrible, terrible logo that had been on the book for several issues.
I'm actually lettering the book right now, and I have taken a little bit of inspiration from your lettering on your balloons. Like my balloons are kind of a tribute to those oval balloons that you use. I generally don't do ovals that much, but for that one, I kind of just do a little homage to you.
I loved what Gaspar did on so many of the things. I didn't know this until years later, but I was swiping wherever I could from sound effects and titles in a lot of the Marvel books. And I found out that Gaspar was doing the title page on almost all the Marvel. And then someone else would do the rest of the lettering. And he's probably my favorite letterer of all time. Up at DC initially from 75 to 77, I sat there and made minor corrections on lettering, or I would add a line of dialogue or something like that. And it was really difficult for me to give it that bounce that Gaspar had, or that John Costanza had, or Ben Oda. It was difficult, and I always thought I failed at it. I guess after it was reduced down and printed and all that, maybe no one noticed, but I always thought I had not lived up to what those guys had done. I've never really liked my own lettering. There have been times when I've looked back. I was putting away some comics the other day up in the book room, and I found something I thought, oh, this is pretty interesting. Wondered who had done it, and it was me. And I didn't recognize my own stuff, and I actually kind of liked it. And something happened a few years ago. I might have told you this story, Greg. I got a package from DC, and it was a bunch of Batman Secret Files issues. And I thought, why in the world are they sending those to me? And I was skimming through it, and there's a Mike Mignola Batman story in there. And I thought, geez, oh, this is beautiful. I love his work. His line work is so simple, but effective and really good. And I thought, why is he back to doing Batman? He's making a fortune on Hellboy. And then I started looking at the lettering. And I thought, oh, wow, who did this? I could learn from this guy. And I turned back to page 1, and it was me. I'd forgotten the story. It was a story that was done like 10 years earlier and never printed because Denny O'Neil thought it was too humorous. It harked back to the Batman TV show, that sort of thing. And then finally they decided to print it. And by that time, I'd forgotten all about the thing. And I honestly didn't recognize my own lettering, and I liked it, which is strange.
That's a lovely story. I think it's really funny how a lot of hand letterers have always felt that their letter forms should be like, they don't like their own letter forms because they're too like awkward or organic. And that's the exact thing that everybody else loves about hand lettering. Because that's, I mean, at this point, you can easily replicate exactly the same letter forms using a typeface, right? It is the organic part. It's the fact that somebody sat down and did this that actually makes it look great. And Gaspar and I think John Costanza knew this because their letter forms are incredibly fluid. Like, I was actually thinking about this one day. I was reading a Costanza book and I was like, how do you make a typeface out of that? Because every single instance of his letters is completely different, but they all still fit together. And I think it's like similar about your letters as well. Like there's some of those letters where like T's and A's, where they kind of vary quite a bit, but they completely feel organic to the rest of the lettering.
Now, I was looking at one of the art books that have been put out over the past few years. I love those things where they shoot from the original artwork. There was one of RoboCop versus Terminator, and then, of course, the earlier Alien book that Walt had done at Heavy Metal. It's as close as you're going to get to the original artwork to see those reproductions of it. But again, I was kind of happy with some of the lettering I'd done there. Not all of it, but I had a tendency, I've tried to get away from that, but if I did an eye, it would curve a little bit. And that used to really bother me. And now I think, well, it actually kind of works, but I wouldn't do that anymore.
I can actually see that in your digital line lettering. Your eyes are much straighter now. Even I think that even the leg of the R is like that looks different now. Like even the bowl and the leg, they're much more precise now than they used to be back then.
That's the exact word that Tommy Lee Edwards used. I was doing Turf for him. Loved that book. The writing by Jonathan Ross I thought was so good. There's a lot of lettering there, but if you take out one word, it has a bad effect on it. There's no redundancies. His writing was really good. Tommy's artwork was wonderful. But I was trying to fit all that lettering in there. And the first issue and a half, I think it was lettered right on the artwork. And after that, in order to speed things up a little bit, we decided to go with this thing that I'd already done for Titan. And Tommy was happy with it, but he said it's a little too precise. So I have to be deliberately messy. Maybe I should be more messy. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea at this point because it's very easy to do really immaculate lettering and just have it mistaken for a typeface at this point because that's how people assume you would do it. Like I was thinking about this. I was looking at some early Tom Moore's lettering, like Orzechowski's lettering, and it's a lot more bouncy. And I think I was talking to him on Facebook at some point and he said, I really like one day sat down and just like for a week or so practiced my letter forms so that I could get them that precise because I always hated the fact that it looked organic. And I was just reading this and I was like, what are you talking about? This is so beautiful. Yeah, I mean, both versions are beautiful. Like his more precise letter forms are also amazing, but it's almost inhuman how he like gets them all like exactly the same every time.
Well, the initial interior lettering that I did at DC, I remember Saul Harrison coming by my desk one day and he said, you should be able to take a piece of paper and lay it down there and it should go straight across on the bottom and the top. And I really tried to do that, but it was like being confined somehow. And I thought, well, the O's, if they're the same height as the I's, they look too small. And so I would bring them up with S's and all, and I was bouncing all over the place before I knew it. And I can't help myself. It seems more interesting to me than just exact height thing that Saul was talking about.
Clem Robbins talked about this once. Like he's created a typeface based on his lettering that has like 20,000 letters because like he's trying to replicate his hand lettered look. And he was talking about it one day when he said, the reason Costanza's lettering, while being so dynamic, looks like it fits is that each letter is reacting to the letter before it and the one after it. Mm-hmm. That's what they're reacting to. Every E doesn't need to look the same. It just needs to fit between that G and that P or something like that. So then I started looking at Costanza's lettering based on that. And I realized like, sometimes this E will have like just a little shorter top stem because there's a V in front of it. So, it's just kind of really reacting, just subtly reacting to the next letter as it goes. And I've tried to do that in my hand lettering. I think I'm very bad at it at this point, but that's why. The thing is, you're not trying to create mechanically correct letters. You're trying to create organic lettering that just reads right.
Yeah, you're not setting type. You're not putting individual preset letters onto a thing to build a word. You are drawing a word as an image. And
there's a big trend for analog stuff these days. For example, like a lot of people love LPs and like risograph prints and all of those things. And the attraction to those is the imperfection of the medium, right? Like a risograph print is like every print is going to look a little different. An LP will have like certain warmth to the sound because it's a physical medium.
Mhm.
And as digital media gets easier, there is a value to the imperfections of pen and paper and all of those things, where there's just like, at the time that was your only medium. So it made sense to try and get it as perfect as possible. But now, like, you want to work for the charms of the actual medium.
Yeah,
That's actually why I started hand lettering, because I was like, you know what, there is a certain thing to the fact that somebody sat down and drew every single letter. And that adds something to a particular book.
Yeah, you did a really good episode with Haas of Panel by Panel where you were talking about that particular aspect and the, the beauty of imperfections versus the sterility of perfection. Let's move a little bit over into working with collaborators, lettering as part of a book or a project coming together. You working on Blue and Green was your second or third collaboration with Ram and Anand? I know you did Graffiti's Wall. But...
My fourth collaboration with Anand and third collaboration with Ram and Anand. Anand did like a 4-page Simpsons thing at some point of time, and I lettered that. Bart Kira, are you aware of this Bart Kira project?
Yeah.
So it's basically like a redo of Akira with Simpsons characters. And it's just a fan project. It's like, it's not a paid thing or anything. So Anand did 4 pages for that. And that was the first time I ever tried to use hand-drawn sound effects. Then we did this thing called Miracle Men, which is like a 6-page painted comic. And then the first proper collaboration was Graffiti's Wall. Yeah.
Going back to the band analogy, which I do apologize, I may have subconsciously swiped that from Panel by Panel. If you're just like, that seems a little familiar, I may have said that, then, apologies. But when you get into a collaborative routine with certain creators, John with you and Walt, or you and Tommy Lee Edwards or John Paul Leone, it's almost like you've made this band and then you go into the studio, you make an album, go away, and you come back into the studio, make an album, and do that. Let's pick Blue and Green as an example for this. When you were coming back together and saying, how do we work on this? You as a letterer, how do you fit into that conversation? How early do you go in? How much input do you have in the creation of this project, or like your space in this project?
It's with Ram, it's quite early on because we are good friends and we kind of talk almost every day. So I'm aware of everything Ram is working on, whether or not I'm going to be on it, even his other DC projects. I'm also one of his, like, there's white noise, but he also sends his scripts to me to read, just like, I think he needs some nice sounding words once in a while. So I tend to hear about his books very early on. I tend to hear about it when the idea happens. Like, I knew about Graffiti's Wall for like 2 years before it happened. Even Layla Star, I was aware of this for like 4 years. He would keep telling me, I've got an idea for the 3rd issue. It's going to be narrated by a cigarette. And then like 4 years later, I get to see that actually happen. So with Ram, it's very early on. And I also know whether I'm going to be on something or not fairly early on. Because if it's a DC thing, for example, like, it has to go through other people. If it's a creator-owned thing, we can actually just decide it on the phone. So with Blue and Green, I always knew I was going to be on. Same with Graffiti's Wall. And with both of those projects, I was the one who decided to hand letter it, because with Graffiti's Wall, I think we were getting drunk in a bar. And I asked Anand, how are you going to draw this book? He's like, I think I'm going to draw it using gel pen on cartridge paper. And I was like, I'm going to letter it using gel pen on cartridge paper. And then in the next year, I had to teach myself to hand letter. So I could actually do that. And with Blue and Green, what happened was, towards the end of Graffiti's Wall, there was a big crunch time. So there was a time at which I had to letter like 20 pages in 2 days. And that's like hand letter 20 pages in 2 days. And that's apart from my regular lettering work. So with Blue and Green, I knew that I didn't want that to happen. And Ram was, you know what, you can do a digital pass on this. It's fine. Like, you can just letter this digitally. And when the pages started coming in, I actually did a digital version. But even Ram has never seen it, because the moment I did it, I was like, this looks wrong. Like, there's just no way we can do this. So instead, I decided to come up with a digital hand lettering process, so that if towards the end, Anand was a little, he was still working on pages, I could, technically speaking, go ahead and letter it, like using the script. And then once the pages were in, I could kind of copy paste the lettering and then draw the balloons and all of that. So that was the first impetus for trying to do this on the iPad. And then once I actually did a draft where the letters were far more immaculate. And Ram was like, this looks like a font. If you're hand lettering this, let it look like hand lettering. Right. So I created this new style with like, it's kind of like all slanted to the left, as if I'm like constantly pulling the pen like this. And it's slightly inspired by Art Deco style, like, so all the round letters are really round and all the tall letters are really kind of slim. So that makes each letter look different because you have to react to the letter in front of it before you draw it. Right. So I kind of created that style. And originally I used white caption boxes. And this was one input that Ram gave, like, which was that Anand was going to use a lot of white on his pages. So there was no point for the caption boxes to look white because that would actually intrude on the things that Anand was trying to do. So we went for this pale blue style. And even the balloon style, which is like, it's slightly off register. So the white of the balloons and the black lines are slightly off each other. They're not quite matching. So that would have been very difficult to do if I was lettering it on paper. So I walked him through the lettering of a page and I showed him how I was drawing the lines. And he was like, okay, once you do the white stuff, before you draw the black lines, could you just move them a little? Could you just kind of like everything a bit so that it looks off register? And I tried that and it like really looks nice. So it was a very collaborative process, mostly with Ram actually. Like Anand doesn't really like, even as the artist, he's like, no, Bidi knows what he's doing. It's fine. But Ram has a lot of opinions. So the style was actually kind of created with Ram together. And we are working on Radio Apocalypse now for Vault. And it's an issue by issue project rather than a whole graphic novel. So we knew that I wouldn't have time to do the whole thing at once. So we decided to go for like a font, like a typeface for this one. And it's still like a nice organic looking typeface. And I've scanned a lot of pencil lines and turned them into balloon strokes in Illustrator. So there's some gaps in them. They look like imperfect lines that have been drawn on paper. So that's entirely done in Illustrator, but I hope it still has like a little bit of the feeling of hand lettering. And one thing we are about to try with issue 3, which I requested, was that I feel if you draw sound effects on the board, then the whole page goes to the colorist and that colors everything, including the sound effects, right? And I think that gives the sound effects an organic look that digital sound effects don't always have. So I've actually asked them that, can I get the whole book in black and white? I will letter only the sound effects and then send it back to you. And then you can send it to the colorist and they can color the whole thing. Can we try and do that? So we are trying to do that with the next issue. Let's see how that works out.
Would it change how you worked if you knew like these caption boxes were going to be a really dark color or a really light color? Or John might be able to talk about during your ongoing DC stuff, did you have to worry about making lettering choices based on certain color choices? Maybe
well, there was a failure in the process years ago, and I'd like to think that I had a little hand in making this better, but it was true of everybody, but especially DC for some reason. The lettering was added sometimes after the coloring was done or as the coloring was being done. And sound effects, titles, that sort of thing, the narrative balloons, it was all white backgrounds because the color had come in and nobody had said, well, maybe we ought to make this red here. So everything was white. And the first Batman thing that I did, this is going back several years, not the first Batman thing, but the first one that I did with the computer, they did that. I got a printed version of it, and this title that I worked out, I thought maybe they could use red. I didn't know because I hadn't seen the coloring of the page, but I thought it's something really punchy there. It was white on a background of white. And every single narrative balloon in it was black letters on a white background. So I talked to them and said, after my lettering is added, can you send it to the colorist and have them make the color decisions on this rather than just leaving them all white? And they started doing that afterwards. And I've noticed they've gotten a lot better on it.
Yeah, at this point, the process works quite differently. So what I tend to do is I like getting the colors back so that I can adjust my lettering with the palette, because that's a tool that digital letterers have, right? Like we can actually adjust the colors of the letters. So I generally try and do that. But once in a while, you just have to guess at what colors will be. So I have had occasion where I've had a red sound effect printed over a red background. So it doesn't really stand out very well. But most of the time, they at least give me a PDF of working letters. So I can at least just keep it like side by side and then change some of the colors.
Mhm.
And ideally, I like to actually pluck out colors from the palette and use them in my lettering. So I've got a few, I think I can try and show you recently. I'll have to look for it. But I've actually used like half-tone dots and stuff on the letters. But at this point, it's entirely down to the letterer. It kind of doesn't go to the colorist a lot, which is why you these days see a lot of artists doing their own sound effects because they know that they're going to go to the colorist and the colorist is going to color it rather than the letterer.
Mhm.
So I was trying to get in on the process where I was like, can we try and do this with a very old process, which is like, I will do the lettering over black and white, and then it'll go to the colorist and they can kind of color over it. So yeah, it's quite like with my image books. So for example, with my creator-owned books, I'm the one doing the delivery to the publisher. So I tend to get to revise my lettering based on the colors quite a bit.
Do you enjoy having that responsibility in a way, sort of that oversight? I know John being on production staff at DC, but also art directing for Heavy Metal, you have a really wonderful combination of in the trenches production stuff and also a creativity, mindset. Do you maybe enjoy part of that aspect of lettering?
I enjoy having the control, but not the responsibility. It's actually really boring work. But, I know that my lettering is being taken care of if I'm doing it. On the other hand, I mean, Image and everybody else still has a production staff looking at it. Like they're the ones who do the print tests and all of those things. We are kind of still just putting it together for them. But we have more control over the art and the colors at that point. Like we are kind of the ones who decide what that looks like. And then like we are trying to make sure not to mess that up. But I wouldn't say I enjoy it. Like it is boring work. It's not fun work. John?
The same for me. I can find something that's going to go wrong and warn them about it. But my wife, I'm glad I never followed her advice, but every time something like that happened, she would say, "Oh, just let it go." And I can't, I know a bad thing is going to happen to it. So I'll fix it up or let them know about it. And some things have to do with DPI even. Ideally, I like the final art to be scanned at 600 DPI. I've worked with people who wanted 1,000 DPI or 900 or something like that. We're just really gilding the lily. And a few years ago, there was a Stan Lee book for Archie Comics, and they scanned that at 400, and it looked horrible in the printing. I honestly do not know what has happened here, but I told them, why didn't you do it at 600? So they did for the third issue, which turned out to be the last. But now I've been working on things where it's 400 DPI or 350 even. And it scares me, but they seem to be printing
pretty close.
fine.
I think what's happened is that the printing techniques are much better now. So for example, we used to have to worry about overprints quite a bit before, like when digital lettering just started, because then colors can get off register, right? That's not really a big problem at this point. Like you can even use so I've used white lettering over black with like a little red mixed in, and the white still prints fine. It doesn't really actually go off register all that much anymore. So I think that's the thing. I work on a lot of 400 DPI books and they're fine. You don't print badly. I think printing has gotten better.
Speaking about off register, this is a bit of a tangent, but things that don't exactly match up. Whenever you're reading a comic book story and somebody has a newspaper, and I think maybe you see where I'm going with this, it's almost like a roll of the dice. It's like, did the artist draw in the text on there? Is it going to be composited? Is the composite going to look right? Is it not? Is that like, as you're looking at a script and just see, there's a potential wording area. Are there particular things about lettering that are like pet peeves or things that you're just like, oh man, that just bugs you when you see it?
There have been several things like that with me. Some of them going back to when I was a kid. I remember Harvey reprinting a bunch of nice Black Cat stories from the early 50s. And this was maybe 1966 or something like that. And her boyfriend was a reporter. So they would often do stories from his point of view. And the narrative balloons would be typewriter type, which was fine. But when it was reduced down compared to the original version, that typewriter type was so tiny And
Mhm.
I wanted it to be the size of typewriter type. And later, I was working on The Shadow at DC. And there was a story where the same thing happened, that all the narrative balloons were typewriter type. And I made them bigger than typewriter type. So when they reduced down, they would be the size of typewriter type.
Nice.
And there have been lots of instances where maybe a folded newspaper, a rounded thing or something, you had to get the lettering in there. And it was okay if you freehanded it, but it really didn't look like type. And sometimes if you use actual type, it looks too much like type. So I used to play around with that. Now I can make it fit the artwork. If the newspaper is rounded at the top and straight at the bottom, I can do that. It's wonderful. I really like that. And I can play with the type a little bit and maybe take it out of focus and bring it back in so it comes out as not, well, there's a movie, Anastasia, an animated one from years ago.
Mhm.
They had this MacGuffin, as Hitchcock used to call it. It was throughout the movie. And they drew it for one size, a nice close-up. And all they did was reduce it for the rest of them. Other sequences, it might be 40 feet away, and it looked awful because, and you have to anticipate things like that. And
Mhm.
and when you're
You have to
working.
redraw that, right? Like you have to draw the outlines again. It's like
Yeah.
optical type. Like a typeface that's going to look good at 72 points is not going to look the same at 12 points, right?
Yeah.
It's optical sizing. That used to bug me about animated movies as well. I'm like, no, you just have to redraw it just a little, like just fix it.
Yeah.
Even in
Apply it for
comics,
art.
sometimes,
Yeah.
it's like reduced down from a different panel, and then the line work doesn't match, and
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
tell. Like you're the artist, you should be able to tell.
It's amazing how many little things have to go into making something look invisible. I guess going back to a newspaper, getting that title, that headline that they've copied and pasted on, has to be in perspective, has to be the right sort of opacity so that it's not too bright, that it's not too dark. You just, so
Exactly.
anyway,
All of those things. Yeah.
yeah. Moving on to a happier topic, I would like to talk about some of John's collaborators, particularly John Paul Leone, who sadly we lost last year. Can you talk a little bit about how you first started working with him in your collaboration?
It came by way of Tommy Lee Edwards. They had been friends for years. Although I met John Paul when he was taking Walt Simonson's class at SVA. Brilliant, brilliant guy. Like Al Williamson, he never knew how good he was. And other people are like this too, but what a genius. And like Walt and Tommy, he kept getting better and better. Most artists, they reach a plateau. And if they're lucky, they stay there. And if they're not, they start going backwards. Walt and Joe Kubert and so many others, they kept moving higher and higher and higher, on what they were doing. His stuff was so brilliant. We talked about Wintermen before doing it, and he opted for the circular balloons.
Mhm.
He had seen some European people do that, and I think Toth did it one time, based on something that he had seen with European artists. And Toth, of course, did his own lettering lots of times. He was, it was so good. I did a thing for Dark Horse years ago called Aroma, and then it came out as a graphic novel. And I was trying to be Alex Toth in that one and missing by a million miles. But it still was really interesting to try to do something the way he would have done it.
Yeah. We did a podcast episode about Alex Toth,
Yeah.
and I think I went through like 7 completely distinct styles of his, and I think there were probably like a lot more. He would just keep trying different things with the lettering. It was so interesting. Like he would try those inward facing tails. He would try these blocky balloons that would kind of all fit together at the top, like almost geometric shapes. Even I think the black lines with the white backing, I think he used to do those as well, like just like you did. So he just one of the most innovative letterers, was not even like a letterer by profession.
I remember talking to Mobius one time. He actually came up to my office and we sat and talked. He was in the United States for some reason. We talked about lettering, and I was nervous because I had been doing this semi-Mobius stuff in the translations of his work. And I'm not sure that he wasn't just putting me on here or something, but he said, "Oh, you're doing a fine job." I wasn't sure, but we got to talking about different artists who did their own lettering. Of course, Toth was at the top there, Frank Thorne, Jim Aparo, so many people. And Barks I already mentioned, although his wife came in and kind of continued things for him there. But he said that he couldn't understand artists who didn't do their own lettering. He said it would be as if he drew a page and then brought in somebody else to ink all the heads of the characters. And it's true. I think ideally you're doing this, and I've done it to, here and there in the past, to create something yourself where you do everything yourself. Maybe somebody else could have inked it better or whatever, but there's a purity to it and a uniqueness. And I'm all for that.
No, I absolutely agree. I think Mobius, I carry that. I think he was interviewed about his Silver Surfer book, and he said that I would rather letter myself badly than have somebody else letter me well, because it's like I need to feel like the same hand lettered the whole thing as drew it. And I've always thought that more artists should letter themselves, and exactly like that. Like, artists should not just do digital lettering. I think artists should integrate the balloons into their compositions and stuff. So essentially, I keep saying I want to talk myself out of a job. But even in my work, that's what I try to do. Like, I try to imagine how this artist would have liked their artwork approached. And these days we actually go through different styles, right? We'll go through like 4 or 5 style options. So I let the artist decide what feels closest to their spirit. And I think Mobius would still have hated that, but I'm comfortable with it.
Yeah.
No, but even his lettering style, I think it was originally inspired by Frank Ingley, because Frank Ingley's style, I think somebody was reading Terry and the Pirates. Wait, I'll tell you what, Gillane. Yeah, so the artist called Gillane, he was reading Milton Caniff's strip and decided to ape those letter forms. And he was Mobius's mentor. So essentially, it's the 3rd generation copy of Frank Ingley's work.
So it's like Alex Raymond to Al Williamson to Mark Schultz, but
Exactly.
the passing down of the artistic DNA to Somni, so on and so forth. The integration of lettering into art. Can you think of any of your particular favorite instances where a sound effect has been integrated into a image particularly well? I mean, I guess obviously everything by Eisner, right? But do you have any personal favorites of things where you're like, that is an excellent integration of a sound effect into a panel, either in sort of a meta way or in like an actual sort of textural way in sort of like the reality of the scene?
There have been several times, I think starting with Walt, where a sound effect becomes the panel. And then there are people in it, in front of, usually, or behind or partially behind the sound effect, but the borders of the letters of the sound effect or the borders of the panel. I did that on that Frank Miller Superman thing that was done a couple of years ago.
Oh, Superman Year One.
Yeah.
No, Jovan.
And I've done it in other places too, but it starts with the artist. They have to make that decision that the sound effect is going to become the panel. I like that. And going back to Marshall, there were things that he did that were just brilliant. And this is a case where the artist did it. Like I said, I was just inking pretty much what he had there. But the art, the lettering, if it can be seen as a continuation of the artwork, I'm happy. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah. Mr. Workman's work is obviously like a big inspiration for me on that. But other than that, I think Ken Bruzenak on American Flag is just like the design work of that lettering is just incredible. Like, there's so many things. How do you, like, what was the conversation? Like, how did you guys get to that point where that happened?
Yeah.
That's a big curiosity for me. Other than that, I really liked Frank Quitely's sound effects in Batman and Robin 1 to 3, where he would essentially, like, there would be a gun, shooting, and the boom would be in the flames itself. Somebody would be thrown against the wall and the wall cracks would say crack. And that's something you can only do as an artist. Like, the letterer just can't do that. And I'm perfectly fine with that.
Yeah.
The other thing is Nick Dragotta on East of West would do these big sound effect panels, and he would design the panel to be the lettering from the beginning. Like, the letterer wasn't coming in and doing that. It was Nick Dragotta himself. He would literally change the composition of the panel to make sure that the important thing was happening between the 2 O's rather than at the corner or something like that. Like, he would literally compose the panel based around that sound effect. So I think those three would be big ones.
The one that, I mean, it may not be the most visually impressive, but the one that I always come to is, again, it's the artist doing it. Issue 348 or 349 of Incredible Hulk. The artist is Jeff Purves, and it's the issue where the Absorbing Man, Crusher Creel, runs up against the Hulk when the Hulk is in Vegas. So this is Peter David, Gray Hulk. He's wearing double-breasted suit, fedora, looks great. This is actually following up from an issue of Thor where Absorbing Man fights Thor, and he basically absorbs the dimensional warp from Thor's hammer, and he gets sent off into limbo. Well, now he's back. Anyway, so the Absorbing Man has, as his weapon of choice, a big wrecking ball on this chain thing. So he's swinging this thing around. The panel is like a horizontal panel. You're looking at him. He's sort of facing the reader. He is swinging the ball from behind his back over his head and down to bring it down to the big boom. The whoosh or whoomp sound effect of it moving through the air is written as if it's traveling with the ball, and it's drawn in perspective. So it starts off, the W is not only clearly in the background, it's also like flipped. So it's like upside down. So it's starting from like upside down, and that word is following the arc of, and I think there may be speed lines, or maybe it's using, maybe the word is sort of the speed line effect to have this, this ball around. That whole run of Jeff Purves of Hulk stuff is maybe like 8 or 10 issues. There are a bunch of really, really wonderful sound effect integration by the artist, really, really unsung. And that one, again, stuck with me for 30 some odd years since I read it.
Clearly,
that is genius.
Paulo Rivera did a bunch of those in The Valiant, where essentially like something would be like kind of going like this, and the sound effect would be traveling like that with it. Or, the sound effect would be like partly hidden by the grass where like somebody's running. So the bullets are hitting the grass and the sound effect is literally popping out of the grass like that.
Nice.
And it's all like, the artist has to do those things because those things really have to be planned at the art stage. Or, I mean, you need to integrate the letterer, like doing it on the boards or very early on where the letterer can actually plan it with the artist.
Go ahead.
There was a Flash cover back in the 1960s, maybe it's 1965 or 66, that Carmine Infantino drew and maybe Murphy Anderson inked. But I remember just my eyes practically fell out when I saw it, on the spinner rack when I bought it. The regular Flash logo wasn't there. It was this huge thing that took up most of the cover at an angle in perspective. It had the Flash, I think he was lying there and the villains were surrounding him or something, one of the villains. And just brilliant and really caught your eye too. But I've often wondered, did Murphy Anderson ink that Flash thing that was there, or did they bring in a letterer to do it? And I remember Neil Adams did a cover one time.
Is it the X-Men cover?
Oh no, this was much later on, maybe 76 or 77 or something like that, up at DC. A science fictional group of characters. Can't remember the name of it now, of course. But he did the logo. He penciled it out and he inked it and then handed it to me to ink his logo. And I inked it pretty much as it was. I think I made one minor little change on it. But in both cases, Carmine and Neil, they did it. They originated this, and then maybe the inker inked it, or maybe a letterer was brought in to actually do that part.
I love those logos that interact with the cover. Like, I think there's that famous Hulk cover where the Hulk is, I think, breaking the logo or carrying it or something. I think recently Ryan Otley redid the logo. Like, he redrew the logo just to draw it, and then he drew it just slightly more crumbly, and because he really wanted that, the feeling of drawing that Hulk logo.
Yeah, I know there's a Art Adams version of that when Hercules took over for a bit, so they had him based in there. I think Carrie Andrews did one when he and Bruce Jones were doing the book back in the early aughts, so that's a very popular. The X-Men thing I was asking about was issue 57 or 8. The famous Neil's got the X-Men on the X-Men logo because it's the living pharaohs holding up the thing, and they're like, nobody will know what the book is because they're covering the logo, and you're like, I mean, maybe, but also like they're being covered by the characters, so maybe that would. So you had to do the ultimate, whatever, editors. I mean, present company executive,
Yeah.
obviously.
I think Darwin Cook, when he did his Spirit run, he did a bunch of like really innovative splash pages. I loved those. Like there was one that looked like very windy, or like, he's falling from a building and the logo is falling behind him. Like really fun stuff. I think artists really love doing that. And for good reason. It's a really fun way of composing.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about lettering careers and self-management. Because I feel like this year, last year has been an important year for Aditya in terms of finding a balance or an equilibrium. Looking back on it, do you have any particular bits of advice that you would like to pass on in terms of things that have allowed you to stay not only just sort of in this career, but engaged as much as you have over the years?
I'm actually working on a little post to talk about the way I learned how to manage my time and my work, because I ended up 2020 overworking myself almost. Like I did around 150% of the pages that I should have done. And that should have been my max. And that was just way too much. It was not good for me. Letterers are kind of so far behind in the whole team run that our schedules end up very crunched. So I've kind of figured out a system to manage that schedule quite a bit. So like that self-management part has become really important for me for the last 2 or 3 years. I'm going to write about it, hopefully to help other letterers who are kind of facing similar situations, because I know they are. Like we talk to each other and I know a lot of really overworked letterers at this point. Yeah. But my advice would be that just because you're coming towards the end in the production process doesn't mean that people should be able to walk over you, right? I think a lot of letterers, including me before, like let's say 2 or 3 years ago, because in the last 2 or 3 years, I've genuinely felt like, okay, you know what? I have a stable career at this point. But before that, I would bend over backwards for requirements that were, looking back, quite unreasonable. People who wanted me to work on really tight turnaround times, or people who just wanted to noodle with the lettering. So they would be happy if I stayed up till 6 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, I'm working with a way better process now. And literally, I've never had to stay up for work. I'm wondering why for the first 4 years of my career, like I was doing that twice a week, So my advice would be like, you are an important part of the team and you should be treated as such. People should be budgeting time for you. Like if you're always having to letter a whole issue in a day, then they're clearly not budgeting time for you. And that's really unfair on you. Like you should not do that book. I think that because we love comics, we tend to see almost every job as a favor done to us. And that's just wrong. It's work and should be treated as work. So that would be my advice. Like stand up for yourself. Also, actually, this is not advice for people of my generation. It's actually, if there are any veterans listening, you guys should be charging way more than you guys do. Like possibly including John, I don't know. Because I have heard some rates from veteran letterers where I've been freelancing for 6 years and working for like 9 years total. And I get paid more than that. Like you folks have been working for like 40 years. You should be getting paid like 3 times as much as me. So.
Well, the best advice I ever got from anyone was from Basil Wolverton. Maybe that's Basil Wolverton. I always called him Mr. Wolverton, so I never really knew the proper pronunciation of his first name. But anyway, he told me to learn to do everything. And this was when my lettering was terrible. And I thought I was making some progress in art. I was still several years away from being on the verge of professionalism with my artwork. And the writing was, I was working on it. And I didn't do a lot as far as coloring. I'd made a decision years earlier in an art class in high school that I was going to concentrate on black and white because it was hard enough. I didn't want to bring color into the whole thing. Later on, especially in my days of heavy metal, I was forced to make decisions about coloring and to color stories and all that. It's still, I think, my weakest link. But yeah, if you learn something about every aspect of comics, you can make the whole process easier and you can realize what the other people have to go through in order to get the work done. And you can help them in one way or another, sometimes after the fact. But I've made decisions. Well, there was a wonderful British artist, just incredible. And he had drawn this story that I lettered. And we used to talk on the phone, a wonderful guy whose name has flown out the window here again. But he had a panel in this one story where it was a long shot of this man and woman sitting at a table in a restaurant talking. And then there were people in the foreground. And he had worked it out. I told him, you should do this. Don't rely on the editor or assistant editor to do it. You should decide where the balloons go. And when I lettered them, if I have to move one or something, I will, but I'm going to follow, for the most part, what you set down, because you're the artist and you know what you're doing and you know what you don't want covered up and all this. Well, when I got the artwork, it came with a Xerox guide to balloon placement, which is helpful if you're doing the Legion of Superheroes or, something like that, where maybe you don't know all the characters. But they had covered up an important part of that panel. And I moved it around a little bit and got it behind some of the characters. So the characters in the foreground were in front of that balloon, but the characters further back, it was back behind them. I sent him a copy of it and he called back and said, "Oh, thank you." And so sometimes when somebody makes a bonehead mistake like that, you can rectify it. But knowing what goes into the writing, what goes into the artwork, and how the readers have to take this in, the readers have to be a part of this whole thing too. You have to know something about them. And sometimes it helps to put something aside for a day if you've got the time and then read it over as a reader, not as the guy who worked on it. And sometimes you wind up making changes then, but it helps.
I think that my favorite writers to work with are people who are very aware of how a page is composed and drawn. Like they have some drawing backgrounds, even if they're not artists exactly, but like they know exactly how composition works. And that really helps because by the time they do the lettering script, I don't actually have to worry about anything anymore because they've seen all the pain points and kind of taken care of them in the script. Like, for example, Ram draws himself. He's always been a very composition-oriented writer. And I have almost zero trouble lettering his pages. The problem is, like, he's very demanding because he's like, look, I did all this figuring out for you, so your execution needs to be, like, completely up for scratch. So he'll throw, like, titles at me which are in, like, extreme perspective. Or, like, that entire floor should be the title. Like, let's do that. And I'm like, okay, you help me out with the remaining 21 pages. I'll do this one page for you.
Yeah, the rest of the book's silent. I'll do your, title on the floor. That's how that'll work. So there you have it, folks. Please do not forget to like, subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you are given the opportunity to do so, because guess what? It really helps us out, and we would super appreciate it. Like I said, next week is the Aditya Bidikar episode on May 7th. So, until we meet again, hopefully soon, my name is Greg. Stay safe, keep enjoying those funny books, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening. Systems disengaged.